This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
So welcome everyone to the History of Sexuality seminar, which today is a joint seminar with the Life Cycle seminar, of which Tim is one of the conveners. So Tim is our speaker today, and he's a senior lecturer at the University of Northampton. His research interests at the moment are focused on vernacular attitudes of the male body in the long 17th century. He's had a number of journal articles and book chapters published, including, for example, Women's Clothes and Female Honour in early modern London, Women, Ale and Company in early modern London, and Misogyny, Jest Books and Male Youth Culture in 17th century England. Tim's first monograph came out earlier this year. It's got a fantastic cover. I don't know if you can see it. You probably can't see it properly. Anyway, it's a great cover. I haven't read it yet. And it's called Women, Work and Sociability in Early Modern London. And its focus is on how women from the middling sorts and the labouring poor fashioned identities as honest individuals of good repute. Tim is also one of the conveners of the Life Cycle seminar, as I said. And Tim is speaking today on attitudes to ejaculation in early modern England. He's going to speak for about 50 minutes and then we'll take questions afterwards. And normally at the start we go around and give a quick introduction of who we all are. As there are so many of us, we thought we might skip that today. But if you ask a question afterwards, it might be nice if you just say who you are. Okay, so I'll hand over to you, Tim.
Okay, thanks very much, Jane. The title of this paper is relatively vague, and that's partly because I wanted to give a paper on the topic, but I didn't really know what I was going to argue, and I felt that vagueness was, when one is offering a paper in advance, vagueness is often a virtue. There are a number of things that I wanted to do in this paper. The first half is a bit of a summary of some of the key literature on ejaculation and male sexuality in England between the Renaissance and the start of the Enlightenment, I suppose, from the early 16th to the early 18th century. I then want to talk in more detail using a series of court cases. Some of these gleaned from references I've come across in secondary literature, but also quite a lot gleaned from the records of the Old Bailey proceedings, which are available online, and which some of you working on 17th, 18th, 19th century history may well be familiar with. This paper is the beginnings of my thinking about the project that has just been mentioned on the male body in early modern England. Trying in part, I hope this is what it will achieve, to open up a wider range of sources, I suppose, to think about the body, or at least use sources that historians have been familiar with, but which haven't really been used to think that much about the body before. So the first half of this paper may be reasonably familiar in terms of content to those of you working on the early modern period. I hasten to add, somewhat simplified this to try and get through a lot of material. So if some of this seems debatable or somewhat dumbed down, I apologise. It's more to sort of set the context for how my own work perhaps differs from some of the existing scholarship in the field. In early modern England, orthodox medical theory, based on inherited ancient wisdom and permeated by ideas about class and gender, held that the ejaculation of semen during sexual intercourse, like the secretion of excrement, bleeding, purging and sweating, restored balance to the fluidity of the humoral body. Yet such ejaculation needed to be regulated, since timely retention of seed promoted healthier conceptions and increased the likelihood of male offspring. Although opinion differed on this matter, and some experts believed the sex of a child was determined by which seed predominated in the womb rather than those other factors. What was agreed on was that too frequent copulation was problematic, since it resulted in weakened seed and weakened progeny, and might also have disastrous obstetrical consequences such as monstrous births or birthmarks on the child. Semen itself was regarded as the vehicle for the generative matter, sperma, which enabled conception, which itself was regarded as refined blood which passed through the brain, spinal marrow, kidneys and testicles en route to the penis. Its nature depended on the soundness of the blood from which it was concocted, how long that blood or sperm had been retained in the seminal vesicles, and which sex had produced it. Since ejaculation involved the emission of the purest part of the blood, it was believed to lead to tiredness, a theme I'll return to later on in the paper. And the quality and quantity of semen produced depended on the nature of the man or woman in question. At this point, I should point out that I'm dealing here with male ejaculation. Within the sort of model that historians such as Tom LeCoeur have set up, of course, you could argue that gender differences are much less pronounced. In terms of the broader interest of the book project that I'm working on, though, this is focused very much on male ejaculation. Not to say that I don't think we should, have some work being done on female ejaculation, but one can't do everything. So anyway, the quality and quantity of semen produced depended on the nature of the man in question. Partly this was to do with complexion. Fair-complexioned men were said to ejaculate more than dark-haired ones. And whilst excess in both food and drink might we concede, for example, the semen of drunkards was regarded as infertile since it was too moist and too much of a liquid in residue. Lean men, by contrast, who survived on a watery or pungent diet were believed to produce more sperm since their bodies did not retain the nutrients in the form of fat. Males were said to originate from stronger sperm, which might be produced by either man or woman. Women were said to be produced from weak sperm, and if parents produced different qualities of sperm, then the quantity emitted by one over partner, so scrolling down, determined the sex of the child. Although men's seed was always thicker and hotter, the more potent seed was by definition the most male, and might be emitted by either a man or woman. The semen of men who had coitus too frequently was believed to revert to its previous bloody form, referring back to some of the comments at the start of the paper, whilst that of boys and older men was thought to be unable to impart movement to matter, so age was also a factor. Semen was regarded as one of the causes of libido, which manifested itself in the form of a genital itch, whose intensity depended on the quality or quantity of matter. Such itching could be relieved only by the chafing of intercourse or masturbation, which produced a heat which was diffused via the blood vessels to the rest of the body. As warmth and pleasure increased, the violent movement of the body led to the production and ejaculation of semen. The pleasure experienced during intercourse was believed to be connected to the quality of the semen and the speed of its expulsion, both of which determine the likelihood of successful generation. Now, that sort of summary of some of the key findings of the more, I suppose, mainstream medical literature of the age, which draws very heavily on the work of Tom LeCoeur and of Gail Cohen-Pastor, has to some degree been critiqued, but has also been reinforced by historians looking at erotic and pornographic literature. And I'm thinking here particularly of the work of Sir Tulalen on 17th century pornography and Karen Harvey's work on 18th century erotica. Within 17th century pornography, there was a discourse in which a hierarchy of pleasure was outlined, in which the height of sexual pleasure consisted, according to Tulalen, of penile penetration with ejaculation, the emphasis there on ejaculation as well as penetration being necessary for pleasure. Within these texts, semen was credited with, quote, amazing powers into production of female pleasure, with particular emphasis placed on quantity and temperature, since the heat of the sperm was regarded as a catalyst for female orgasm and hence reproduction. Such texts noted that a woman's ability to sense her male partner achieving his sexual climax might in turn trigger or accelerate his own orgasm, and the pleasure of a woman's orgasm was held to be directly related to the heat of the male ejaculation. Failure to achieve ejaculation, either due to old age or impotence, were subjects of mockery within such texts. But unlike, perhaps in 21st century discourse, premature ejaculation was regarded as relatively unproblematic, since it merely allowed opportunities for the man to display his virility again once he had recovered, at least within the discourse of erotica. If we move forward from the 17th into the 18th century, when writing about conception, authors of 18th century erotica drew on a range of competing theories, which they deployed strategically. And according to Harvey, this was driven by a desire to stress that although women and men played similar roles in procreation, that of the male was qualitatively superior, to quote Harvey, even vital. Within these 18th century erotic texts, semen was depicted as the fruit of life, the vivid stream, the animating sap, or the prolific juice. An inability to produce semen was a sign of failure. Semen was thus, to quote Harvey, evidence of fertility, that most essential of male attributes. So within both medical literature and erotica, pornography, but broadly defined, there are a series of ideas about the importance of ejaculation, how it should be moderated, but also a particular emphasis, especially in erotic literature, on the superiority of male ejaculation. And this relates very much, according to Tulalen and Harvey, back to the process of procreation. Now, on one hand, these discourses help to reinforce patriarchal ideologies, but they also undermine them. The literary theorist Mark Breitenberg, almost 20 years ago, argued that within the humoral economy of fluids, semen was regarded as the most purified form of English masculine and aristocratic blood, the very substance of masculine power as well as its signifier. But he also noted that the generation of semen, whilst being the most quintessentially masculine moment, in other words, ejaculation was proof of gender and sexual identity, it was also, according to Breitenberg, finally just a moment. Ejaculation represented the supreme moment of masculine disempowerment and vulnerability, according to Breitenberg, who's drawing very heavily here on psychoanalytic theory. According to Breitenberg, ejaculation was a literal and figurative emptying out of the masculine principle. Put simply, masculine erotic desire generates the material of masculinity, argued Breitenberg, but also destroys it. Orgasm threatens masculine agency and self-control, in part because it represents a feminine inability to regulate the flow of one's fluids. Orgasm thus signalled both the loss of masculinity, but was also an evacuation necessary for psychological health, as medical practitioners and medical texts reveal. This idea of the sort of inherent contradiction within ideas about male orgasm has been picked up by other literary theorists as well. Ian Moulton's work on early modern pornography and erotica has made similar comments based on a wide variety of texts, including, for example, John Fletcher and Thomas Massinger's play The Custom of the Country, first performed in London in 1619, in which the rake, wittily named Rutilio, emphasis there on rutting, I suppose, is debilitated by working as a sex slave in a male brothel in which he is expected to service the needs of the nymphomaniac city dames. Social historians have noted also the problems of the need for married men in particular to be able to ejaculate and to prove their patriarchal status through reproduction. And here the work of Elizabeth Foister and Helen Berry has been particularly influential. The ability of married men to ejaculate and to pleasure their wives so that they too achieved orgasm was of central importance to the maintenance of patriarchy in early modern England. Pamphlets, folk tales and poetry all described how a woman's alleged insistence on equal sexual enjoyment could reduce even the boldest lover to impotence or cause him to ejaculate prematurely. Once fully aroused sexually, a man was under pressure to satisfy his female lover, and his ability to provide her with an orgasm was part of the means by which women tested male potency, at least according to Anthony Fletcher. Being unable to satisfy one's wife in this manner led to fears of cuckoldry. In other words, if I can't do it, maybe another man can. And jokes about unchaste women bearing illegitimate children, with the butt of such jests being the gallant or husband who ended up supporting a child who was not his own, were fairly commonplace across the 17th century. Impotency was taken seriously in separation cases, since women's adultery was capable of disrupting the correct inheritance of property. And some men who had been cuckolded by their wives resorted to violence in order to reassert their manhood. Nonetheless, paternity was always open to question, with its determination dependent on physical resemblance between the alleged father and the child assigned to him. In early modern England, sperm was believed to transfer qualities of character from a father to his offspring, as well as being a metaphor for lineage and immortality. Fathering legitimate children, Patricia Crawford noted, enhanced a man's status, showing him to be complete and blessed by God. Men, as well as women, were held responsible for infertility in 4 ways, according to Elizabeth Foister and Helen Berry. Men were blamed for if they failed to achieve an erection, for the deficiency of their penis in terms of size or shape, for their inability to produce semen or seed of sufficient quantity and quality, and for their failure to develop an emotional or sexual compatibility with their wives. Sexual positioning was deemed important too, with the man on top being the ideal. And men were not to be over hasty during sex and not to withdraw too quickly after ejaculation, since this would lead to rapid insertion of air that might prohibit the woman's body from being given time to respond to impregnation. Paternal as well as maternal imagination played a role too, with those men who pursued sedate or intellectually demanding work deemed to be less fertile than those who performed hard physical labour, whilst those in the countryside were deemed to be more fertile than their urban, particularly metropolitan counterparts. Men themselves were concerned about their performance in bed and consulted surgeons and physicians about their fertility problems, experimenting with various remedies such as eating foods known to be aphrodisiacs, of which Jennifer Esmonds has written in detail recently, also by carrying lodestones, taking the waters in spa towns, or visiting trees and standing stones held to have magical properties. Revelations of impotency also had detrimental effects on the reputation and credit of married men, socially and politically, since the inability to control their bodies suggested that they failed to manage their emotions too. Impotency also suggested economic dependence and a lack of emotional warmth within a marriage, as well as impacting on family reputation, since a son would be unable to continue the lineage. So the work of medical historians, historians of erotica, and social historians of the family have generally emphasised that ejaculation of fertile sperm was a vital act for a lover or husband to accomplish. In other words, ejaculation is a good thing within, or is depicted as such within much of the existing literature. What I want to suggest in what follows is that we might want to rethink our opinions on this somewhat by looking at other types of primary evidence. And here I want to draw particular on references to ejaculation in court depositions relating to cases of rape or extramarital sex, because I believe these present a more complex picture. Existing work on rape has emphasised how victims often referred to how their attackers rearranged, dirtied, tore, or otherwise spoilt their clothing. And the meanings of these references has been debated. Miranda Chater suggested that for the victim, clothing represented everyday life and served as metaphors for both the injured body and sexual honesty, providing a means for the victim to cope with what had happened to her. In other words, there's a displacement activity going on. Rather than talking about the damage to your own body, Chater's argued that female rape victims refer to the damage that's done to their surroundings, their clothing, their household objects, how their work is disrupted. She's also suggested that the significance of references to clothing lies in the fact that for much of the 17th century, rape was still considered primarily as a property crime rather than an offence against the individual. This goes back to medieval ideas about notions of ravishment, and historians of rape have tried to sort of chart a transition from this medieval notion of rape as a property crime, where husbands or fathers could in fact be the main beneficiaries of a prosecution rather than the actual female victim, towards a much more modern sense of rape in which the victim is the one who is raped. By contrast with these views put forward by Chater, Garfield Walker has offered a more complicated, more nuanced in some ways, argument. She has emphasised how the arrangement of clothing was part of a more general discourse of sexual responsibility, and that the sight of a woman with her clothes, in particular her skirts, disordered, was indicative of sex regardless of whether it was consensual or otherwise. Men accused of rape often told how the women concerned had not objected to having their clothes rearranged. So Walker is here drawing attention to the counter discourse made by the defendant in court. Torn garments were, according to Walker, likely not just to connote rape or indicate rape, but also to connote sexual struggle in general and lack of consent. But the act of tearing clothes was deemed to be one of abuse and incivility more generally. So, inactive interpersonal violence brought before the quarter sessions in early modern England, frequent references are made to hats being knocked off, bands being torn, sleeves being ripped. So the point Walker is making here is that there's not necessarily a direct connection between the disordering of clothing and the disordering and sort of more general sexual assault. And even torn garments, she suggested, might signify consensual, albeit disorderly sex. So in other words, clothes might be torn in the heat of passion between a consenting couple. In her more recent work, ongoing work on rape, Walker has also discussed, as well as the disordering of clothes, the importance of ejaculation within discussions about what constituted rape. According to Walker, penile vaginal penetration against the will of a female aged 10 years or older constituted rape in early modern England, whilst those girls under the age of 10 who were penetrated in similar fashion were deemed to have been raped regardless of whether or not they had given their consent. In other words, these were minors. They didn't, even if they claimed that they had given consent, this didn't protect the defendant against an accusation. She also notes that many jurists interpreted the term carnal knowledge, which is very commonplace within legal discourse when referring to sex, to require the emission of semen in order to make a rape. Otherwise, it was only an assault in the eye of the law and no rape. Proof of ejaculation in order to secure rape was abandoned by the English courts, presumably the British courts as well, in 1828. But even before this time, many judges seemingly permitted it to be presumed by law rather than overtly made out of evidence. And Walker notes that practice was inconsistent. So this links into some of the points I'll be raising in a moment, which is that when we're looking at some of these rape cases, there is not a direct connection between references to ejaculation and prosecution. And it would be interesting to try and work out why that isn't the case, but the evidence I've got doesn't necessarily provide evidence of that. So in what follows, I want to explore how these references to ejaculation, sometimes onto clothing, sometimes during the course of alleged or actual rapes, how these were phrased within the language of legal sources. And much of the evidence that I'm going to be drawing on comes from the earliest proceedings of the Old Bailey. These were, for those of you who don't know what these are short journalistic accounts of trials held at the Old Bailey in London. The earliest ones that we've got surviving in print come from 1674. There was 10 years ago, there's a large digitisation project by Tim Hitchcock and Bob Shoemaker to put all of these online. So they're now all keyword searchable, and social historians use them very extensively. The actual original text was sold in London and more broadly across the country for around sixpence. They were certainly aimed at a broad audience, but the audience in particular would be metropolitan, because most of the trials involved London cases, and that's where the actual proceedings were produced. There are problems with the sources, however. Due to the limitations of contemporary shorthand, as well as laws on what could be reported and the nature of the format of these reports, provide us with imperfect accounts of sexual interactions. So like any other type of legal depositions, some of which I'll be referring to, these don't give us the entire picture. What I would suggest, though, is that they give us some insight into an alternative set of ways in which the act of male ejaculation was imagined in the 17th and 18th centuries, some of which goes against the points that have been made in the literature that I've just outlined in the first part of the paper. When looking at rape cases in the 17th and 18th centuries, some victims, but by no means all, spoke of how the accused man had ejaculated onto their clothes during the course of the assault. In one of the most well-studied and well-documented cases of rape in early modern Cheshire, explored in an article by Steve Hindle nearly 20 years ago, the clergyman Stephen Jerome attempted to rape his maidservant, a woman named Margaret Knowsley, in his bedchamber, but it succeeded only in ejaculating over her clothes. A couple of decades later, Alice Edge accused one Joseph Ottewell, the vicar of Wrenbury, of attempting to commit adultery with her in the local schoolroom, where he, quote, tried for 1/4 hour to have carnal knowledge, till at last he fouled her garments with his nature. Drawing on the aforementioned Old Bailey cases, in October 1684, Thomas Benson, the apprentice of a vintner living without Bishopsgate, was found guilty of raping Elizabeth Nichols, the daughter of his master. Her aunt had discovered the rape because when her own daughter was ill, she went to borrow Elizabeth's, quote, foul shift, and by it found some man had been dealing with her. Now, that latter example is obviously problematic. Elizabeth's shift was obviously fouled with some form of bodily fluid. Whether that was semen or blood isn't specified. If it was, so there's lots of problems here about, is this proof of ejaculation or not? Possibly. I mention this because it shows us how these depositions and trial reports may hint at and perhaps be able to be used in order to explore this particular topic, but not all the cases always give us the precise wording or details that we would want. So what these cases do, I think, though, is that just as the disordering of clothes offered women a means of describing obliquely the damage which their assailant threatened or had done to their bodies, so too the staining of clothes with ejaculated semen offered a means for victims to highlight the intent of their assailants. The bodies of these men quite clearly betray them. However, as I pointed out a moment ago, such references were not always guaranteed to ensure a prosecution. In December 1721, George Duffus was indicted for assaulting and attempting to commit sodomy with one Nicholas Leader. Nicholas deposed that on the 9th of October he had been at a meeting house in Old Gravel Lane with the prisoner, and after the service had ended was approached by Duffus, who, quote, seeming very religious, began some discourse in commendation of the minister and of what he had then preached. Following similar conversations over the next 3 or 4 Sundays, Leader told how Duffus insinuated himself into the good opinion of the prosecutor and invited him to drink with him at the Three Merry Potters, a public house run by one Mr. Powell at the Hermitage in the Minories. The men met a few days later and spent the evening drinking, at the end of which Duffus asked if he might lie with Leader, since it was late and he lived a great way off. Now, within an early modern context, sharing a bed with a member of the opposite sex isn't necessarily a sexual, sharing a bed with a member of the same sex, I should say, is obviously not necessarily a sexual action. This was quite commonplace in lodging houses. It's quite commonplace for journeymen and apprentices to do this. So Leader's request shouldn't be imagined in the first instance as being a sexual come-on in that sense. Duffus's request shouldn't be imagined as a sexual come-on. And Leader was happy to oblige. However, after they had been in bed a little while, Duffus began to kiss and embrace Leader, quote, thrust his tongue in his mouth, called him his dear friend, and got on his back. Leader repulsed these advances, quote, 3 or 4 times, telling him if he would not be still, he'd turn him out of bed. At which point Duffus seized Leader by the throat, turned him on his face, and forcibly entered his body about an inch. But Leader continued to struggle and threw Duffus off him, preventing his assailant, quote, from making an emissio seminis in his body. As a result, Duffus was forced to ejaculate, quote, in his own hand, and, quote, clapping it, his semen, on the tail of the prosecutor's shirt, said, now you have it. Leader stated that at this point he would have thrown Duffus out of the house, but did not, for fear of disturbing his ancient grandmother, who lay ill in the next room. The following morning, Duffus told Leader that he need not be so concerned at what he had done to him, for he had done the same to several others, naming in particular a cabin boy. Leader responded in somewhat aggressive fashion by obtaining a warrant from the Justice of the Peace, one Tiller, and took it to the meeting on the following Sunday, along with a constable. Duffus responded by leaving the meeting rather hastily, and when he spotted that Leader and the constable were pursuing him, he began to run, but was seized and brought before the justice, whereupon he, quote, cried, entreated for mercy, and begged they would not suffer him to open shame, adding they were all sinners, and it was hard for a man to suffer for the first fault, which seems to somewhat contradict what he told Leader earlier on. This quite clearly was not his first fault, and Mr. Powell, the son of the owner of the Victory house in the Minories, where Leader and Duffus had been drinking, deposed that Duffus had made similar advances to him on the 12th of October. Using the same excuse that he was far from home and needed a bed for the night, Duffus and Powell had not been long in bed before the former began to kiss his host, before taking hold of his genitals, saying, "How lean you be, do but feel how fat I am." Duffus then seized Powell's hand and placed it on his own genitals, and soon after climbed on Powell's back, and keeping him down, thrust his penis betwixt the deponent's thighs, and there emitted. Afterwards confessing that what he had done was, quote, very common, and he had often practised it with many others, at the same time desiring the opponent to act the same with him, which Powell refused to do. How was this resolved? Well, having considered the evidence, the jury returned a special verdict because, quote, the spermatic injection could not be proved. Now, I find this a somewhat odd conclusion, and the paper, the document itself, does not define what the special verdict was. It seems rather strange, given the evidence presented, that further proof of ejaculation was needed. I mean, there are 2 of the instances being described that I've just described to you. There's quite those bringing the prosecution explicitly refer to Duffus having ejaculated. In one case, there was presumably a stained garment which may or may not have evidence of semen on it. So I'm a little puzzled by this, but it certainly shows you how, linking back to Walker's point about ejaculation and how it was used in evidence of rape cases, that references to an ejaculation didn't necessarily enable a prosecutor to bring a successful case in cases of sodomy or rape more generally. There are not that many cases within the Old Bailey papers between 1674 and 1740 where ejaculation is explicitly mentioned. But there are one or two others which I'm going to mention briefly here. In August 1730, Gilbert Lawrence of St Bride's was indicted for committing assault and buggery on one Paul Oliver, then 14 years old. When the attack took place on the 11th of July that year, Paul had been apprenticed to a gilder for about 6 weeks. One Saturday night, after Paul and Gilbert had gone to bed, presumably in the same room, if not actually in the same bed, Gilbert jumped on Paul at about 2 o'clock in the morning, held him down so that he was almost stifled, then put his privy member into his fundament a great way. And within the original text, privy member is censored. Some of the letters are missed out. Actions which Paul stated had hurt him so much he thought he would have killed him. When Paul was asked if he perceived anything to come from him, he replied that there was wet and nastiness which he wiped off with the sheet, and that Gilbert had, quote, tore him so that he could not tell what to do and could not do his needs, presumably couldn't defecate. Paul told how Gilbert had attempted to have sex with him 2 or 3 nights before, but did not put it in, and stated that the following day, as soon as he could get out, and went home to his mother and made his complaint to her. Paul's mother took him to Justice Blayney, who sent for a surgeon, who, having examined Paul, confirmed that penetration had occurred, and that the fundament was black all round, and appeared like that of a hen after laying an egg, presumably meaning that it was stretched. This evidence, I assume, was enough to find Gilbert guilty, and since sodomy carried the death sentence, he was executed. Obviously, what's interesting from my point of view is the reference here to wet and nastiness. That might refer, of course, to the blood coming from the victim's fundament, but of course it might also refer to ejaculated semen. And this sort of this reference to sort of wetness and vague references to sort of bodily fluid comes up in another case, tried a few months later. In October 1730, John Collier of Hillenden was indicted for ravishing and carnally knowing an 18-year-old spinster, Elizabeth Jones. For clarification, I'm not sure here whether spinster refers to her marital status or whether it refers to her occupation. By the early 18th century, Amy Freud suggested that spinster, and other historians of women have suggested that spinster is beginning to carry its modern connotations of single, never married woman. But given that Elizabeth is only 18 when this assault takes place, I think spinster may refer to how the form of labour that she undertook. On the 16th of September, Elizabeth was walking home from a meeting between 6 and 7 o'clock, and Collier approached her and asked her where she was going. Elizabeth stated that she was going home, and Collier asked where she lived, following her until they reached the bridge near Kingston Lane, at which point he dragged her into the lane, and when she cried out, caught her by the throat, and swore that if she made any noise, he would cut her throat. A struggle ensued, and after Collier had overcome Elizabeth, he dragged her from the main road into Kingston Lane, threw her down on a grassy place where was a rising, with her head lying among the bushes. He subsequently punched her in the stomach several times to stop her breathing, and then raped her. Elizabeth stated that after the rape was over, there was wet within. But despite the evidence of an apothecary, William Cooper, who stated that Elizabeth had, quote, marks of violence upon her and a tumour in her throat, presumably occasioned by the attempted throttling, Collier was acquitted because he was able to summon character witnesses, but also because although the lane was wet and dirty, several witnesses had remarked on the cleanliness of Elizabeth's clothes. So here's another case in which there are vague references to bodily fluids, which may be ejaculated semen, but which may also be the blood of or other bodily fluids of the victim. It's also quite interesting to see here that there is more wider use of what we might now think as forensic evidence. The clothes here are very central to the way in which this particular case is being analysed and in which a decision is being made. The final case I want to briefly touch on is also from the Old Bailey, and this one again comes from late 1730. It involves William Holywell and William Huggins, who were indicted for committing the crime of buggery together. One John Rowden deposed that on the 19th of November, betwixt 12 and 1 o'clock, he was going to dinner, and having heard the old man's door shut, he afterwards heard some persons that seemed to be coming up softly. This, I should add, was taking place in the upper part of the Cathedral of St. Paul's. Rowden hearkened but heard no voices. That suspecting something more than usual, he looked through the light of the newel stairs, he being about 30 or 40 steps from the prisoners, and did discover the prisoners, quote, in very indecent postures, whereupon he made haste to them, and surprised them in the following posture. Huggins' breeches were down, he stooping very low, so that he could not see his head. His shirt was turned up on his back, and his backside was bare. Holywell was standing close by, with his foreparts to the other's posteriors, and the body in motion, but his foreparts he could not then see. This is the evidence being given, his back being towards him. Having been surprised thus, Huggins was busied in putting up his breeches, and Holywell struggled with him to have got from him, and to have gone off, and tore his turnover, which I presume is an item of clothing. But he having disengaged himself, Holywell got to the church door, but could not get out, it being locked, and he having the opponent having the key in his pocket. As a result, the pair were locked into the side aisle, and I've lost track of who's giving the evidence here. And Rowden went to get the clerk of the works to go with him to acquaint the dean with the matter. When the party came back again, Holywell was out of the place where they had left him, and could not be found for a considerable time, but at last was found hidden in a gallery adjoining to the organ loft. And when the pair were taken before the justice, Holywell's shirt was examined, and there appeared plain tokens of emission. In his attempt to defend himself, Huggins, quote, called a great many of his neighbours, who gave him the character of an industrious man in his calling, which was that of a waterman, of a loving husband to his wife, of a tender father to his children, of an honest man in his dealings, and of a religious man that kept to his church constantly on Sundays, and apparently to St. Paul's Cathedral for other things as well. And one of the last men they should have suspected as to such practices, and should more readily have credited his familiarity with women, he commonly associating himself with women more than men. But this character did not avail him against positive and credible evidence, claimed the reporter, and Holywell not calling one single evidence to his character, and the fact being plainly proved, the jury found them both guilty of the indictment. So this latter case shows that although no description is given of how the verdict was arrived at, the evidence of plain tokens of emission, fairly obviously a reference to the ejaculation of semen, may have helped to override the copious support offered by the compurgators who gave evidence on Huggins' behalf. The examples listed so far have been compiled from cases relating to non-consensual intercourse or attempted intercourse. But ejaculated semen was also referred to in fornication cases brought before the church courts. And these forms of evidence, for those of you who aren't aware of them, are particularly rich for the late 16th and the 17th centuries leading up to the English Civil Wars of the 1640s. The courts are abolished during the 40s. They are restored with the monarchy in 1660, but the evidence isn't as rich for the later part of the 17th century. But the evidence for the earlier period is quite useful for the things that I'm interested in here. And there are two examples that I'd like to draw attention to. The first comes from the late 1590s, when from the Canterbury Consistory Court, when a servant named Crench gave evidence of how he had heard his fellow servant Elizabeth Purfrey and one Peter Collibrand making a noise at the entrance to his master's house, and that when Crench was locking up, he, quote, saw where the said Colbrand's nature lay upon the ground of the porch. Similarly, in the late 1630s, Ethelreda Baxter told the Norwich Consistory Court how William Noble, a married man, maltster and churchwarden, solicited her on her way home and, quote, did pull out his yard and put it into her hand, promising her money and malt, and telling her that, quote, his pintle was better than her husband's. Other witnesses, who summoned before the court, deposed that Noble had placed his penis on the plank of a stile and, quote, spilled his seed upon the ground. Now, given that these cases are coming before the church court, they evoke the biblical passage of Genesis, in which Onan is said to have spilt his seed upon the ground. It's often evoked as proof within Christian discourses to the sinfulness of masturbation. But Tom LeCoeur's recent analysis of this passage in his book Solitary Sex has argued that Onan's crime was his failure to continue the line of his father Judah by refusing to have sex with Tamar, the widow of his dead brother quote, lest the child should be born in the name of his brother. And according to LeCoeur, within medieval and early modern Europe, the sin of Onan was used both by Jewish and Christian churches to attack both birth control and abortion, rather than masturbation per se, although clearly that's linked into these issues. With both Catholics and Protestants imagining Onan as a disobedient and selfish adolescent who disobeyed his father, failed to help his brother, and put in danger the continuity of his line, and thus the coming of the Messiah. According to LeCoeur's analysis, Onan's sin was to prevent a birth through an act of uncleanness and self-pollution by emitting semen somewhere other than in the vagina of a woman. And I think these cases of illicit extramarital sex fall into this category of pre-modern onanism as defined by LeCoeur, as they involve the spillage and thus wastage of semen for it being ejaculated in places other than the vagina. In that sense, it's a waste. So I think that the sort of LeCoeur's analysis here helps us to kind of offer some sort of contextualization for that. Okay, so some concluding comments from all this. What I hope I've done in this paper is to argue that attitudes to ejaculation might be either or positive or negative, depending on the marital status of the participants in the preceding act. Whilst a husband was admired for his ability to ejaculate fertile semen and provoke his wife to orgasm, similar actions betrayed the motives of fornicators and rapists. In another version of this paper, I've also argued that some married men seem to have been pleased that they've failed to climax during their sexual trysts, particularly these were extramarital ones, as it should that they did not have to accept the responsibilities of fatherhood. References to ejaculation in cases of sexual assault, which where the majority of my evidence has come from, might be employed in order to help ensure a conviction. But since the authorities seem to have been able to have chosen whether or not to draw upon such evidence, such references were by no means guaranteed to ensure a conviction. So, we might be though the individual bringing a prosecution might deliberately insert references to ejaculated semen, fouled clothes into his or her deposition. That was in the hope of securing a prosecution, or because that's actually what happened. But it doesn't seem to me, at least based on the limited evidence I have looked at, to seem to be a direct connection between conviction rates and these sorts of references. I think most importantly, and a comment that I would want to end on, is that these narratives suggest that the pre-modern humoral model of the body retained its dominance in vernacular everyday culture until at least the turn of the 18th century. It seems to me that there's still these kind of narratives and stories, to some degree, fit into those sort of humoral models that I began the paper by outlining. But I think also that they offer us a more complex set of ideas about male fertility and ejaculation. Medical treatises and household conduct manuals and erotic literature to some degree all seem to be representing ejaculation in a very positive fashion, something that should be actively encouraged. But I think if we look at these cases of unwanted sexual congress or attempted sexual assault, then that model becomes more problematic. And I think, therefore, by integrating some of this legal material into our narratives about the history of the body, we'll hopefully be able to provide a more rounded picture of attitudes towards sexuality and reproduction in early modern England.
Great, thank you.